Today I'm going to talk about sculpture and show you some examples of how I use sculpture in my work. I work with Encaustic, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that as well. And I've made a number of different sculptures. I've got a couple behind me that I'll be talking about. But sculpture is a really interesting material to work with as an artist because it is not flat, it's three-dimensional. So you kind of have to turn it, or either if it's an object that you can hold in your hands, it's a very tactile experience to interact with that art. And you need to turn it around, you need to see it from different standpoints in order to fully understand it. Or if it's a large sculpture, you need to move around it physically to get a sense of the voids and the surface areas, the texture and all of that. So it really involves an activity on the part of the viewer to get that multiplicity of views. Also, the material that's used for the sculpture is important often. It often has a kind of a symbolic meaning to it and really adds to the depth and the understanding of the piece and the artist's intention. So I will be talking to you about that as well and some of the materials that I've used. Also scale, I'll be talking a lot about that, how large something is. If you make it very tiny, it's kind of an intimate experience that the artist has with, or the viewer has. Or if it's very large, you feel sort of overwhelmed possibly by the sculpture. If it's soft, or if it's hard, or flowing, or very taut and tight, if it's very delicate or very aggressive, you have a different kind of reaction to that piece of art. So as artists, we're always using those tools to communicate that emotion that we have, or to try to work with the viewer to anticipate what kind of reaction you might have to that, and try to create a certain effect when you're looking at our art, and really to try to capture some human emotions. So I mentioned that I use beeswax for my art. So I use a material that's called Encaustic, which is a combination of beeswax and tree resin, so both natural materials. And it can be painted on. It needs to be melted in order to be used. So you can paint it onto a material. You can dip the material into the encaustic, and then it just soaks right into the material. You can drip something on. You can carve into it. You can add texture to it, or you can smooth it out and buff it out, and it becomes this beautiful sheen to it, a sort of shiny surface that you'll see with my work later on. But it's a very pliable kind of material. It becomes hard physically, but it's pliable and versatile in the ways that you can use it. It can also have pigment added to it, but it has this beautiful way of, you can look through different layers. You can layer materials in with wax, and I'm just gonna slip that out of the way. You can layer materials in, and you can work both two-dimensionally and three-dimensionally with it. So obviously today I'm talking about it three-dimensionally, and I often find, now that I've been working with wax for about 15 years or so, that I often come across a material and I'll say, well, I wonder what that will be like if I dip it in wax or I paint it in wax. And often it really brings out a translucence to the material because it soaks right in. Obviously you can't put something like plastic into wax. They don't adhere to one another, and it will melt. But all kinds of other organic material can be used with wax to great, exciting effect. So I'm going to talk first about a piece, installation piece that I've done, and it's called A Sense of Place. And I don't know if you can see what this is. I'll show you the latter side of it, the back side of it. If I could have some comments up here, I'd know I'd be able to say, can you guess? But probably you can guess what it is, especially if you come from the West Coast. This is a huge oyster shell, And I've tried to create an installation using this shell and other shells like it to really draw attention to oyster shells. These are quite ubiquitous in British Columbia on the coast, and I think they're really beautiful. I love to walk along the beach, and particularly on the Gulf Islands outside of Vancouver. These oyster shells are just everywhere, and they become kind of normal, and you don't really notice them anymore. They're all broken, they're all ugly on one side, they're very gray and dull. And yet when you look on the other side of them, they're just beautiful. They have this really nacred interior that shines in the light, and I love working with opposites when I'm working with art. I love that contrast that you can achieve with art. So I'm going to talk about that series called A Sense of Place. So what I try to do with that series of sculptures is to try to recreate this amazing experience of walking along the beach where all of your senses are enlivened. And when I walk along the beach, I can smell the salty air, I can feel the wind, I see all of these shells, I can hear the waves. So all of those senses get awakened, and I'm trying to recreate that place by using these sculptural shells. And as I said, I'm very attracted to this sense of opposites. So what I did was I built these shells out of paper. I dipped many layers of tissue paper into wax and then formed these shells out of them. And I'm going to show you a couple of pictures so you can see some close-ups of them. These pictures were taken by Carol McFadden, and they are pictures with my daughter holding that shell. So I'll run through a few, and you can really see a sense of the light, hopefully, that's caught in these shells. I love how there's this contradiction of beauty and ugliness, of protection. So there was a living being inside here, and there's a sense of vulnerability as well, and life and death. So they used to hold life, and now they are just broken on the beach, and they embody that sense of death as well. So I love how that is sort of similar to life and to nature, this kind of cycle of life and death. I have another, I think there's no more. There's another body of work I wanted to show you that's called Afterlife. So with these ones, I built this installation using mussel shells, and I will show you that. I'll just come back onto the screen here. I'll just show you one of these. Again, these are oversized mussel shells, and you can see the same kind of nacred interior, this kind of mother and pearl shiny interior, and then the exterior being very textural, kind of ugly, sort of dull, and this contrast of color as well, dark and light. So again, bringing up those contrasts. So this was an installation piece made of, I'm not even sure how many. I'll show you a few overhead pictures of some of them. Traditionally, I'll go back to those photos for you. Traditionally, mussel shells were considered associated with the feminine because they hold life. They have a kind of vulva-like shape or a uterus-like shape. So they would be symbols of prosperity if they were full of life, and when they were dead, when if it was an empty shell and the crustacean was dead, that they were symbols of misfortune and loss. And I mentioned that I am quite interested by the material that I've used. So I'll go on to another slide here. The material that I used is a surprising one to make this. It's made with Tyvek. And Tyvek you might be familiar with because it is used for building material for houses. So Tyvek is it's kind of like a building envelope material, and what it does is it allows the small molecules of moisture from inside a house when we're breathing or cooking. It allows those molecules of moisture to go out of the house, but it does not allow larger molecules of moisture to come into the house. So if it's raining, for example, you don't feel the rain coming inside it. That doesn't come through that building envelope. So I felt this was a really interesting parallel to the shell, because the shell holds this interior life, much like a home does, and allows that life to develop within. And it has this kind of receptivity. A house has a receptivity just like a shell, and offers this sense of growth inside. And I will take you back to a scene here of my daughter. I've cut off the bottom of the photo, unfortunately. It is a scene of this installation, which is too bad. Maybe I can zip ahead and see it somewhere else. Nope, looks like it's not an easy. That's a little bit more of a sense of it there. It is installed on the shores of Jericho Beach, and I thought it was an interesting parallel with my daughter holding on to that shell, that she was something that I grew inside me, and I thought that was a really interesting additional layering in of that installation. And a funny story about that installation is, as she was putting those shells down on the beach and forming them in a group, a little boy came up and asked if the shells were real. And I thought, wow, isn't that a perfect ending to that installation of setting that sense of place and immersing one inside that space, and how powerful that can be. So I will go back to the screen here and show you a couple of other pieces. This piece behind me is part of a series that I did called Severed Beauty, and I'm going to show that to you. You can see how three-dimensional it is. I have several pieces that I did in this series. Maybe I'll switch it around this side so you can get a sense of it. So these are roses, and this piece is about the commercial floral industry. So I'm just going to hang this back up and talk to you a little bit about that. I have a few photos as well. So I did some research. I love flowers, and I did some research on the commercial flower industry and learned that a lot of pesticides are used in order to create these beautiful flowers that we bring into our homes. And often they are grown in poor countries where people are paid low wages, and they are exposed to all kinds of pesticides as they're applying them onto the commercial flowers. And also, obviously, the pesticides are affecting the environment, and one of the effects is, as there's been a real lowering of the population of bees around the world, and of course that has directly affected me with my art, and wax has become much more expensive as well. But we can see now that there's a whole all sorts of effects from the bee population lowering and affecting flowers and the growth of plants and pollination of fruit, etc., of fruit blossoms. So there's been a very strong impact from this commercial flower industry. So I wanted to do a piece on that to bring some attention to it. And I have some close-ups to show you. A little bit of a close-up there. So what I used for this piece was synthetic fabric. I chose specifically to use polyester of synthetic fabric because I wanted to draw attention to the fact that these flowers weren't really natural in a sense, even though we thought that they were. And then I put a layer of pigmented powder, gold powder, around the tops of all of those flowers, so that that would be sort of a symbol of the pesticides that are used. I've got one more picture here of another version of this. I did several pieces in this series. I wanted to sort of flip the scenario at the end. Part of what I was doing was trying to flip the power relations of that, and rather than the commercial flower industry having this power over nature that it has, what I did was I boxed these flowers in, sort of imprisoned them into a box, and I sealed them with the beeswax, with this natural material. And I was trying to flip that around and sort of with an ironic humor say that it was the flowers that were being imprisoned by the bees and controlled by the bees here. So that was a really wonderful series that I did for a while. I really enjoyed that. And I just wanted to show you a couple of examples of some. If you're interested in trying out Encaustic, this is a book called Encaustic Revelation. It is a collection of teachers who have taught at Encaustic Camp with Patricia Baldwin Segerbrook. She's an American artist and teacher. And inside this book, I have several kind of how-to examples on how to make this series, how I made this series step by steps, and also working with Tyvek and how I used that. So again, each kind of example of that material. And this is a great book for learning some of the basics of Encaustic. I also have some of these pieces that I've been showing you in another book here called Encaustic Art in the 21st Century, a wonderful book of variety of encaustic, of artists who use encaustic. It's a very big, beautiful coffee table book here. So that is a great reference as well. So in this book I have several pieces featured as well, some of which you have seen, this floral piece, this Severed Beauty piece, and then a couple of others, kind of a stained glass window effect. These are made with Lutradur, which is a spun bonded fiber, and this piece which I spoke about yesterday, Daedalus's Gift, and it is made with Lutradur as well. So I won't talk about that sculpture because I talked about it in quite a bit of depth yesterday, but there's another kind of sister piece to it called Icaruss's Sister. Daedalus's Gift is a story about Icarus, and this is a story about Icaruss's sister. So you can get a bit of a sense of the three-dimensionality of this as well, the way that light is caught, and how different materials can be used. So as I said, I've used fabric, I've used paper, I've used Tyvek, all kinds of different materials, and I'll show you a couple more before the end. I wanted to show you one quite unusual material. I would love to be able to ask you to guess what this is, so I'll show you, but I know that you won't be able to answer. They're again florets because I love natural themes and florals. I'll maybe ask when I open up for questions to see if anybody's guessed what this is, but this is seaweed. So I went down again walking on the beach and found some seaweed, and I thought, oh, I wonder what that would be like if I dipped it in wax. And surprisingly, it's very durable. It just soaks in that wax It becomes very translucent and absolutely beautiful. So I have a series of pieces in my collection as part of the culture crawl that are using seaweed as a sculptural tool. And also I have several pieces that I have done using alcohol ink. So I was talking about these yesterday and how sculptural they are. So I'll try and turn that on its side a little bit so you can see the three-dimensionality of that. So these are two-dimensional paintings, but they have a very three-dimensional surface. And I spoke yesterday about the themes. These are all looking at the marine environment and the effects of climate change on the marine environment. So you can see the sculpted characteristic of these ones. These are all tiny, tiny little dots, which may be difficult to see here. Tiny little dots. Each one is added one on top of another meticulously for hours. And it's kind of crazy making and also kind of meditative as well. It's going to show you this one. This is Daedalus's gift, the story of Icaruss. And that's it. So I'm going to go back and get rid of those photos. I'm going to turn the comments on now. So I will happily look and answer your questions and look and see. I'm just going to scroll through here. Kong on the bike thing. So that is, thank you very much, Madeline. I submitted my design. Actually, I have it right here, that little painting. Just grab it. I submitted a design to Moby Bikes for their bike share program. So I took this design and they put this artwork, or will be putting this artwork on the basket, the front basket for the bicycles, and on the two rear wheel fenders. So I'm really pleased about that. I love cycling and I'm just so pumped about seeing my artwork on the bicycles. And there are 4 other artists whose work also was chosen. So thank you so much to all of you who voted for any of the artwork. They were fabulous pieces and I'm really excited about that. And thank you to the Culture Crawl and Moby Bikes for giving artists this opportunity. So I'm gonna scroll back. See what else. Comments. Your voice is so soothing. That is so funny, Carmen. I've heard that before, which is so funny because I don't think I'm a terribly soothing person, but it must be a way of calming myself down when I'm on an Instagram live to try to have a soothing voice. That's great. Thank you. The building material, did I miss what it's used for as a support, or was it dipped in wax similar to the tissue? It was dipped in. So the building material, again, is called Tyvek, Tyvek, and I did not dip it in. I painted it with wax. So first of all, I painted the Tyvek because Tyvek is white, and also I would get it from leftover from building sites, so I would have to paint and color it first, and then I would paint it with wax and with colored waxes, and I also used pigments. So I used dry pigments that were very shiny, lustrous pigments to rub into the surface of the wax. The tissue, however, just to clarify for that question that you had, Lynn, the tissue was dipped in. So I actually took the tissue paper, which of course is very fragile initially, and I dipped that into the wax and pulled it out. And then I would manipulate the tissue and then add another layer of tissue and fuse those together. So for those of you who aren't familiar with working with beeswax and with working with encaustic, you need to fuse every layer. If you've ever kind of scraped off a layer of candle and seen it pop off, that's because the layers aren't fused. So as an artist, we need to make sure all those layers are fused so that the artwork holds together really strongly. That's neat about the kelp. Thank you. Yes, I know. It's amazing how it's not, when it's wet, of course, it does have that translucence, but when it dries, it doesn't have that anymore. It gets very dull. I guess it's the salt on it as well, but when it's dipped in wax, it gets this clarity that's so beautiful. And if you were to hold it up to the light, you would be able to see the light through it. Thank you for your comments. Was the base a gesso on the Tyvek? Lynn asks. Yes, it was, and there is a special kind of gesso that you can get that is meant for encaustic. So you can't use an acrylic gesso. Acrylic and encaustic don't mix because acrylic is basically a polymer plastic material and it does not bind with the wax. So R&F Paints has made, and some other companies also have made special gessos that adhere to materials and that they are porous enough that the wax will adhere to the gesso. So yes, I did gesso it with encaustic gesso. Madeline, I knew hippies that made ice wax candles. That's right. Yes, I know. I was one of those hippies. Sort of in the younger hippie. I was at the very tail end of the hippie era, but I did make a lot of candles in my day, so it's kind of like history repeating itself. And those ice candles were very cool because they would have those great holes in them. Kind of sculptures in themselves because you'd have to move around them and every part of them was different. And you know, kind of like a Henry Moore sculpture is so interesting because it's not just the shape of the sculpture and moving around it, but it's the voids and the hole in the sculpture that makes it interesting. So you could imagine a great big wax sculpture, which would be very cool. All right, that looks like the end of the comments and the questions. I'll see if anybody else wants to ask me anything before I sign off. I will say thank you again for coming and following me with my stories these last few weeks. I really appreciate it, and it's been lots of fun connecting. And I will be available always on Instagram. I love Instagram, and I post a couple of times a day to give a bit of a sense of what I'm doing creatively and what I'm excited about. And I really love connecting with other artists. One of the things about being an artist sometimes is that you work in a kind of a cocoon by yourself. So I really enjoy Instagram for reaching out and having a sense of creative community with people. So I think a couple more comments. You dipped the kelp when dry or still wet. And what did you use for initially forming of the large mussels? So the kelp, no, I dried it because you wouldn't want moisture inside the wax. What can happen is either it doesn't have enough strength for integrity, or it might go moldy because beeswax is such a good preservative that it would preserve that moisture inside. So I let it dry. What I did was I formed it into shapes when it was wet, and then I dipped it into the wax when it was dry. And of course, you probably know this, but kelp has a lot of water content in it, obviously. So when it dries, it really shrinks up a lot. So it really changed in size. But of course, once it's dry, it's very brittle. So so I had to do that manipulation when it was wet. And then, as I mentioned, once I put wax on it, it became surprisingly hard and very translucent. The rest of the question, what did you use initially forming of the large mussels? Was made of Tyvek, the Tyvek building material. And the shell was, the oyster shell was made of paper. See if there's any other questions. Have a great day. Thanks, Madeline. See you later. Okay. Well, I will sign off then. It doesn't look like there's any other questions, so feel free to contact me if you have any questions or comments. Check me out. All my links are in my bio. Thanks again for coming, and take care. Stay in touch. Bye-bye. Stay safe.